January 1944, Italian front. When Sergeant Marco Benedetti and his tank crew spotted Allied Shermans advancing across the muddy fields near Anzio, they burst into laughter. These were the same tin cans they'd been knocking out for months with their superior tactics and battlefield experience. But when the first 17-pounder round from a disguised Sherman Firefly tore through their teammates' armor at an impossible 1,200 meters, their laughter died instantly, as they realized they'd been fighting an entirely different war than they thought. What other deadly secrets were the Allies hiding in plain sight that could turn the tide of battle in a single devastating moment? January 1944 brought cold rain and mud to the Italian countryside near Anzio. The war had turned ugly for Italy. Mussolini was gone, and German troops now controlled the northern parts of the country. Italian soldiers found themselves caught between their former allies, who now treated them as enemies, and the advancing Allied forces pushing up from the south. Sergeant Marco Benedetti crouched in his tank, watching droplets of water drip through a crack in the metal ceiling. At 32, he had seen enough war to last 3 lifetimes. His weathered face showed the strain of fighting in North Africa, Sicily, and now mainland Italy. Dark circles under his brown eyes told the story of too many sleepless nights and too many friends lost. The Italian countryside around them looked nothing like the postcards his mother used to send. Villages lay in ruins, their red tile roofs scattered like broken teeth. Fields that once grew wheat and olives were now churned into thick, sticky mud by tank treads and artillery shells. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with the earthy scent of wet dirt, and something else nobody wanted to think about too carefully. Benedetti commanded an M1441 medium tank, one of Italy's best armored vehicles. The tank weighed 14 tons and carried a 47mm gun that could punch through most enemy armor at close range. His crew had painted a small olive branch on the turret side, a reminder of home and better times. Inside the cramped metal box, 4 men lived and fought together like brothers. Private Giuseppe Romano sat in the driver's seat. Barely 19 years old, but already an expert at coaxing their temperamental machine through the worst terrain. Corporal Luigi Ferretti operated the radio, keeping them connected to other Italian units scattered across the defensive line. Private Antonio Rossi loaded shells into their main gun with the steady rhythm of a man who had done this job 1,000 times. The Italian military situation had collapsed faster than anyone expected. Food was running short, ammunition was rationed, and spare parts for their tanks were almost impossible to find. Many units were operating with half their normal fuel allowance. The Germans demanded that Italian forces follow their orders, but German commanders showed little interest in keeping Italian troops well supplied or properly equipped. Benedetti remembered when his unit had better equipment and higher morale. In North Africa, they had believed in their cause and trusted their leaders. Now, political chaos at home meant that orders often contradicted each other. Supply lines were broken, and nobody seemed to know what they were really fighting for anymore. The economic situation made everything worse. Italian factories that once produced tanks and ammunition were either destroyed by Allied bombing or had stopped production due to lack of raw materials. Workers went on strike, transportation systems broke down, and the government seemed to change its mind about the war every few weeks. Technology presented another challenge. Italian tanks were falling behind the rapid improvements being made by both German and Allied forces. The 47mm gun that had seemed adequate 2 years earlier now struggled against the newer, thicker armor appearing on enemy vehicles. Italian tank crews had learned to rely more on tactics and positioning than on the raw power of their weapons. On this gray morning, Benedetti's unit held defensive positions along a ridge overlooking a wide valley. Intelligence reports suggested that Allied forces were preparing another push northward, but the details remained unclear. Italian reconnaissance patrols had spotted enemy movement, but the thick winter weather made it hard to get accurate counts or identify specific units. Through his periscope, Benedetti could see other Italian tanks spread across the hillside, their crews probably having the same conversations his men were having about home, food, and when this war might end. Each tank represented 4 men and their families, all hoping to survive whatever came next. The radio crackled with reports from forward observers. Allied tanks were moving up through the valley, advancing slowly through the muddy terrain. Romano adjusted his position in the driver's seat, ready to move at a moment's notice. Ferretti tuned the radio to make sure they could hear orders from their company commander. Rossi checked their ammunition supply once more, counting shells they might need very soon. Benedetti raised his binoculars and studied the valley floor. In the distance, dark shapes moved between the scattered farmhouses and broken stone walls. Sherman tanks, the same type his unit had fought before. The sight brought a slight smile to his weathered face. These were machines his crew understood, weapons they had learned to defeat. The American Sherman M4 medium tank was a familiar opponent. It weighed about 30 tons and usually carried a 75mm gun. Italian crews had developed effective tactics against Shermans during previous battles. The key was to let them get close enough for the Italian 47mm gun to penetrate their armor, then hit them before they could return accurate fire. Romano chuckled as he watched the approaching enemy formation. These Americans always advanced in the same predictable patterns, relying on their numbers rather than clever tactics. Ferretti shook his head and made a joke about American crews being too comfortable, like they were driving trucks instead of fighting tanks. But something looked different about a few of the approaching Shermans. Benedetti adjusted his binoculars and studied the lead vehicles more carefully. The gun barrels seemed longer than usual, though it was hard to be certain at this distance. He mentioned this observation to his crew, but they dismissed it as probably just a trick of the light or mud caked on the barrel. The first hint that this battle might be different came when one of the distant Shermans stopped at what seemed like an impossible range for tank combat. The distant Sherman tank sat motionless at the edge of the valley, its long barrel pointing toward the Italian positions. Benedetti squinted through his binoculars, trying to measure the distance. 1,200 meters, maybe more. Far too far for any tank gun he knew about. His crew relaxed in their seats, confident that no Sherman could hit anything accurately from such a range. Romano lit a cigarette and passed it around the cramped turret. The familiar ritual helped calm nerves before battle. Ferretti adjusted his headphones and listened to radio chatter from other Italian tanks spread across the ridge. Everyone seemed relaxed, almost bored. They had fought Shermans before and knew what to expect. The sound came first, a sharp crack that echoed across the valley like thunder. Then Benedetti saw the muzzle flash from the distant Sherman, bright orange against the gray morning sky. His mind automatically started counting seconds, the way tank crews learn to do when calculating distance and shell travel time. 1,000 meters away, Private Rossi's tank exploded. The blast lifted the 14-ton Italian tank completely off the ground. Metal pieces flew in all directions, some landing near Benedetti's position. The turret separated from the hull and crashed down 30 meters away, crushing a stone wall that had probably stood for centuries. Black smoke poured from the burning wreckage, thick and oily against the pale winter sky. Benedetti stared through his binoculars, his mouth hanging open. The hole punched through Rossi's tank was massive. far larger than anything a 75mm gun should make. The armor had been torn apart like paper, not just penetrated, but completely destroyed. Pieces of the tank's side armor lay scattered across the muddy field, some bent into impossible shapes by the force of impact. Romano dropped his cigarette, forgetting about the fire danger inside their cramped metal box. His young face had gone pale, and his hands shook slightly as he gripped the steering controls. Ferretti stopped adjusting his radio and turned to stare at their sergeant, waiting for orders that Benedetti was not ready to give. The radio crackled with confused voices from other Italian tanks. Nobody understood what had just happened. Tank commanders reported seeing the same thing Benedetti had witnessed, but their descriptions made no sense. How could a Sherman gun reach out and kill at 1,200 meters? Italian tank crews had never seen anything like it. Benedetti forced himself to think clearly, despite the shock. He had served in North Africa, where his unit fought hundreds of Sherman tanks. The American 75mm gun was good, but not that good. At long range, Sherman crews usually had to close distance before they could reliably penetrate Italian armor. This shot had been different, impossibly powerful and accurate. Through his binoculars, Benedetti studied the Sherman that had fired the killing shot. The tank looked similar to others he had fought, but that gun barrel was definitely longer than normal. Much longer. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable once he knew what to look for. Someone had mounted a completely different weapon in a standard Sherman hull. More radio reports flooded in from Italian observation posts scattered across the front line. Intelligence officers had been tracking Allied tank movements for weeks, but their reports mentioned nothing about new weapons or upgraded Shermans. Either the intelligence was wrong, or the Allies had managed to keep a major secret. Ferretti received a message from their company commander demanding an explanation for what happened to Rossi's tank. How could Benedetti explain something he did not understand himself? He instructed Ferretti to report that they were under fire from long-range enemy guns, but that answer sounded weak even to his own ears. The second shot came 5 minutes later. Another Italian tank, positioned 400 meters to Benedetti's left, simply vanished in a ball of fire and flying metal. This time, Benedetti was watching through his binoculars when the shell hit. The projectile moved so fast he could barely track it, a dark streak that covered 1,200 meters in less than 2 seconds. The shell punched completely through both sides of the Italian tank, leaving holes large enough for a man to crawl through. The exit hole was even bigger than the entrance, suggesting that the projectile was designed to expand or fragment after penetration. Whatever weapon fired that shell was far more powerful than anything Italian crews had trained to fight against. Romano asked permission to retreat, his voice cracking with fear. Other Italian tanks were already pulling back from their forward positions, unwilling to face an enemy that could kill them from impossible ranges. Benedetti wanted to order a retreat too, but their company commander had strict orders to hold the ridge at all costs. Intelligence reports finally started making sense. For weeks, Allied forces had been moving supplies and equipment through the area, but Italian observers had dismissed most of it as normal Sherman tanks and supply trucks. Now Benedetti realized that some of those normal tanks might have been carrying these new long-range guns. The third shot killed Lieutenant Morelli's tank at 1,300 meters. This time, Benedetti timed the shot carefully, counting from muzzle flash to impact. Less than 2 seconds for the shell to travel that distance meant the projectile was moving at incredible speed, much faster than any 75mm round he had ever seen. Morelli had been Benedetti's friend since North Africa. They had shared food, ammunition, and stories about their families back home. Now, Morelli was gone, killed by a weapon that should not exist. fired from a range that should be impossible for tank combat. Benedetti began to understand that everything his unit believed about Allied capabilities was wrong. The fourth shot found Benedetti's tank at exactly 1,000 meters. The world exploded in white light and ringing metal as the massive shell punched through their front armor like it was made of tin foil. The impact threw Romano against the driver's controls, knocking him unconscious. Ferretti screamed as hot metal fragments tore through his left arm. The smell of burning oil and electrical wires filled the cramped space. Benedetti felt warm blood running down his forehead, where a piece of flying metal had cut him. His ears rang so loudly he could barely hear his own voice as he shouted orders to evacuate the tank. The engine was dead, smoke was pouring through the crew compartment, and he could see daylight through two massive holes in their armor. They had 30 seconds, maybe less, before the ammunition started cooking off. Benedetti grabbed Ferretti under his good arm and helped him through the turret hatch. Romano was stirring, blood on his face, but moving on his own. They tumbled out of their dying tank and ran toward a drainage ditch 20 meters away, expecting machine gun fire to cut them down at any moment. The explosion behind them lifted all four men off their feet and threw them into the muddy ditch. Pieces of their tank rained down around them, some still glowing red-hot from the fire. The turret landed upside down in a nearby field. The olive branch they had painted on its side now blackened and twisted beyond recognition. British voices called out in broken Italian, telling them to put their hands up and walk slowly toward the Allied lines. Benedetti looked at his wounded crew and realized they had no choice. Romano could barely stand, Ferretti was losing blood from his arm, and none of them had weapons that could fight tanks armed with these impossible guns. The walk across the muddy field felt like the longest journey of Benedetti's life. Every step took him further from everything he had believed about this war. Behind them, black smoke rose from 4 destroyed Italian tanks, crews he had known for years now dead or wounded. Ahead waited an enemy that had just demonstrated technological superiority beyond anything Italian intelligence had imagined. The British soldiers who captured them were polite, almost apologetic. A medic immediately began treating Ferretti's wounded arm, while others offered water and cigarettes. These men seemed nothing like the cruel invaders Italian propaganda had described. They helped Romano sit down and checked his head injury with genuine concern. A British tank commander approached Benedetti and spoke in careful, slow Italian. He explained that they were prisoners of war and would be treated according to international laws. The officer seemed genuinely sorry that men had died today, but he also made it clear that this was what happened when armies fought each other with modern weapons. Benedetti asked about the gun that had destroyed his tank. The British officer smiled sadly and explained that it was a 17-pounder anti-tank gun mounted in a Sherman hull. They called it the Sherman Firefly, he said, and it could penetrate any German or Italian tank at ranges up to 1,500 meters. The British had been quietly building hundreds of these weapons while enemy intelligence focused on counting regular Sherman tanks. The numbers hit Benedetti like a physical blow. 1,500 meters meant these Allied guns could kill Italian tanks from distances where Italian weapons could not even reach their targets. The 17-pounder shell weighed 17 pounds compared to the 4-pound shells fired by Italian 47mm guns. The muzzle velocity was almost twice as fast as anything Italian tank crews had ever faced. During the short truck ride to a prisoner processing center, Benedetti saw things that shattered his understanding of Allied capabilities. Endless convoys of trucks carried supplies forward. More vehicles than he had seen in his entire military career. Allied soldiers had new uniforms, good boots, and equipment that looked like it had just come from factories. Everyone seemed well-fed and confident. At the processing center, a British intelligence officer interviewed Benedetti in fluent Italian. The man had studied at the University of Rome before the war and spoke about Italian culture with genuine appreciation. He asked detailed questions about Italian tank tactics and equipment, but he also shared information that made Benedetti realize how completely Italian intelligence had failed. The Allies had been mass-producing Sherman Fireflies for months, while Italian commanders convinced themselves that enemy tank technology was not improving. British factories were turning out 17-pounder guns at a rate of dozens per week, mounting them in Sherman hulls that looked almost identical to regular tanks from a distance. Italian observers had been counting Allied tanks correctly, but completely missing the fact that many of them carried weapons powerful enough to change the entire nature of tank combat. The British officer showed Benedetti photographs of Sherman Firefly production lines, massive factory buildings where hundreds of workers assembled these deadly weapons. The scale of production was beyond anything Italy could match, even before Allied bombing had destroyed most Italian industrial capacity. These were not experimental weapons or limited production models, but mass-manufactured tools of war being built faster than Italian forces could destroy them. That evening, in a clean prisoner barracks with real beds and hot food, Benedetti lay awake thinking about everything he had seen. Italian propaganda had taught him that Allied forces relied on quantity over quality, that American and British weapons were inferior to Axis equipment. The Sherman Firefly proved that this was completely wrong. The Allies had taken their quantity advantage and quietly added devastating quality improvements. He thought about his friends who had died today, killed by weapons their training had never prepared them to face. They had mocked Allied Sherman tanks, while those same tanks were being transformed into instruments of destruction that could kill Italian armor from impossible ranges. The laughter had died with the first 17-pounder round, but the lesson would live forever in his memory. The train pulled into Milano Centrale station on a gray morning in March 1946, nearly 2 years after Benedetti had been captured. The massive iron and glass building looked the same as when he had left for North Africa 5 years earlier, but everything else felt different. Bomb damage scarred the city streets, and people moved with the careful exhaustion of survivors who had lived through too much. Benedetti carried a small canvas bag containing everything he owned in the world. Inside were sketches he had drawn during his captivity, detailed drawings of Sherman Firefly tanks and Allied equipment that had amazed him during 2 years as a prisoner of war. He had also kept a small piece of metal from his destroyed tank, a reminder of the moment his understanding of modern warfare had changed forever. The train platform was crowded with returning soldiers, displaced families, and workers trying to rebuild their lives. Everyone looked thin, their clothes patched and worn. Food was still rationed, and basic supplies remained hard to find. The contrast with what Benedetti had seen in Allied prisoner camps was stark and painful. During his walk through the city, Benedetti noticed how much Milan had changed. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened by Allied bombing raids. Rubble still filled some streets, and many buildings stood empty with broken windows and damaged roofs. The industrial districts where Italy had once built tanks and aircraft were mostly empty lots filled with twisted metal and broken concrete. His family's apartment building had survived, though several windows were boarded up with wood planks. Benedetti climbed the familiar stairs slowly, unsure what he would find. His mother opened the door and burst into tears when she saw him. She looked older, thinner, but alive. His younger brother had been killed fighting the Germans in 1943, she told him through her sobs. Over dinner that first evening, Benedetti tried to explain what he had learned about Allied industrial capabilities. His mother listened politely, but seemed more interested in having her son home safely than in hearing about enemy weapons. She had spent 2 years not knowing if he was alive or dead, surviving on rationed bread and whatever vegetables she could grow in window boxes. The food on their table that night consisted of thin soup, black bread, and a small piece of cheese his mother had saved for special occasions. Benedetti remembered the meals served in Allied prisoner camps, with meat, fresh vegetables, white bread, and sometimes even desserts. The contrast made him feel guilty about having eaten better as a prisoner than his family had eaten as civilians. Romano visited 2 days later, walking with a limp from injuries that had never healed properly. They sat in a local cafe that served weak coffee and talked about the war in quiet voices. Romano had also been impressed by Allied equipment and organization during their captivity, but he seemed more interested in finding work than in discussing military technology. Jobs were scarce, and former soldiers faced suspicion from civilians who blamed them for the war's disasters. Ferretti never returned from the prisoner camp. A British officer had told Benedetti that Ferretti died during surgery to repair damage from infected wounds. The medical care in Allied hospitals was excellent, but some injuries were simply too severe to treat successfully. Benedetti kept a photograph of his radio operator, taken during better times in North Africa when they all believed they were fighting for something worthwhile. In the months that followed, Benedetti found work in a factory that was trying to restart production of civilian goods. The machinery was old and frequently broke down because replacement parts were impossible to obtain. Workers did their best with improvised repairs and salvaged materials. The contrast with Allied manufacturing capabilities became more obvious every day as Benedetti struggled with equipment that would have been considered obsolete in British or American factories. Local newspapers carried stories about American aid programs that were helping to rebuild European infrastructure. The Marshall Plan was bringing modern equipment and technical expertise to countries that had been devastated by war. Benedetti read these articles carefully, remembering conversations with Allied officers who had described their country's industrial capacity in terms that seemed impossible at the time. Young men in the neighborhood often asked Benedetti about his war experiences. He tried to explain what he had learned about the dangers of underestimating opponents, but most of them seemed more interested in heroic stories than in lessons about technology and industrial capacity. They wanted to hear about brave tank battles, not about manufacturing statistics that proved how completely Italian leadership had misunderstood modern warfare. Benedetti began volunteering at a local technical school that was training young men to work in rebuilding Italian industry. He used his sketches and notes to teach students about precision manufacturing and quality control methods he had observed in Allied equipment. Many of his students had fathers or brothers who had been killed in the war, and they listened carefully when he explained how technological advantages could prevent future conflicts. By 1948, Benedetti had married a young woman who worked as a nurse helping war veterans readjust to civilian life. Together they raised a family while he continued working to modernize Italian manufacturing. He never forgot the lesson of the Sherman Firefly, and he made sure his children understood that in a modern world, countries that fell behind in technology and industrial capacity would pay terrible prices. On quiet evenings, Benedetti would sometimes take out his sketches and examine the detailed drawings he had made of Allied equipment. The Sherman Firefly had taught him that wars were won not just by brave soldiers, but by factories that could build better weapons faster than enemies could destroy them. His laughter had died with the first 17-pounder round, but the lesson lived on in everything he built, taught, and passed down to future generations who would hopefully never have to learn such truths through the harsh reality of combat.